Right Honourable Winston Peters.
This question is to the Prime Minister. Is his government committed to evidence-based policy making?
Mr. Speaker.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes.
Unbelievable. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston
Well, if that's the case, why does his government not demonstrate its commitment to evidence-based policy making by collecting comprehensive information on the extent of foreign ownership of New Zealand land and housing?
Order. Member has a right to ask the question. Right Honourable Prime Minister in response.
Sorry, could I just ask the member to repeat it? It was very muffled.
Order.
I would like to ask the Prime Minister, if that is the case, that the answer is in the affirmative, why does his government not demonstrate its commitment to evidence-based policy making by collecting comprehensive information on the extent of foreign ownership of New Zealand land and housing?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do collect information. We collect it both through IRD, who have a register of foreigners who are required to file a return because they own a rental property in New Zealand, and we do record it in relation to the Overseas Investment Office when they approve sales of land above the threshold, which is wherever it is 4.5 hectares or 5 hectares. So we do gather quite a lot of information.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston.
How can the government be collecting quite a lot of information when in the answer nothing was referred to housing whatsoever? And why doesn't the government have a proper house and land register like other countries have?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I hate to burst the member's bubble, but when someone files an IRD tax return because they own a rental property in New Zealand, that is a house.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable
Does the
Winston.
Prime Minister not understand that that's only about a rental? What about the other forms of ownership? And what steps will the government take over the next 3 years to limit the transfer of New Zealand land and housing into foreign ownership, even though the trader over there likes it?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government has policies in place through the Overseas Investment Act that we believe are set broadly in about the right place. And while we acknowledge that there are some foreigners that come to New Zealand and purchase land and assets, we believe that's in the best interests of New Zealand's economic growth. And that is why land sales to foreigners and house sales to foreigners merrily and happily continued every single time he was on this side of the House. Yes, they did.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Given the Chinese government's priority...
Order. Order. Order.
It won't save
the member has a right to ask the question so that I can hear it. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Thank you, Speaker. Given the Chinese government's priority and crackdown on corruption, what precautions is his government making to ensure the proceeds of corruption from that country do not go into New Zealand land and housing?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Overseas Investment Office go through a thorough process when they assess the merits of a purchaser, but Mr. Speaker, we're not responsible for any illegal activity that might take place in another country.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why does the government consider that selling even more of New Zealand's productive capacity to foreigners is a path to prosperity?
Well, right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's because if one looks at the history of New Zealand and foreign investment, we can point to many examples actually where foreign investment in New Zealand, in even land, has been very important for New Zealand. Take the wine industry. We all know the member has quite an interest in the racing industry. Well, the racing sector has quite a lot of investment from overseas, and last time I looked, the member, when he was the Minister of Racing, was slapping those people on the back and congratulating them for what they were doing in this country.
Somebody question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Supplementary question. Would the Prime Minister give us one example that he just claimed happened when I was the Minister of Racing? Just one.
Just one.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I don't have all the snaps and happy pictures taken of him when he was Minister of Racing and wandering around, but I'm sure if he wants to open up his holiday snaps to me, I'll be able to find an example of him patting some foreign owner who was in New Zealand who also owned a bit of a bloodstock here and happily shaking hands.
Question.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question.
Why does the
right
Prime
on.
Minister think he can get away with an answer like that when he hasn't got one shred of evidence to make the assertion? And is it his view that everybody should be running around getting photo opportunities like he does?
Well, insofar as there's some Prime Ministerial responsibility, I'll leave it to the Prime Minister.
I'm happy with my photo opportunities. If the member's not happy with his, well, he has to live with himself.
Order. Question number 6, Barbara Kurigan.